and welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited because this is the first time I'm filming somewhere besides my own apartment. My mom and I are on a staycation at a hotel called Villa Samadhi, which is in Labrador Park in Singapore, and it's an old colonial building. So right now I'm filming from the library, and so that's what explains kind of the beautiful backdrop behind me. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the months of September and October. Those were pretty busy months for me, so I only read 2 books, and they were both from the science fiction genre. I read Ministry for the Future by Stanley Robinson, and I reread Dune by Frank Herbert in anticipation of the movie coming out. I'll talk about Ministry for the Future first. This was a really lengthy read, but I read it with my book club, and it is an imagined future of the world trying to combat climate change, and it takes place over the span of several decades, but mostly in the 2030s. This book came out last year, and apparently it's a part of this new genre called cli-fi, which is really just climate fiction. And Stanley Robinson, who is the author, is pretty well known for writing hard science fiction, so trying to be really scientifically accurate. And you can definitely see that in this book. There's tons of research and modern day studies that he pulls from. And he's really well known for his Mars trilogy, where he actually kind of tells in a historical fashion the story of this future colonization of Mars. And so that's kind of helpful to know when you're reading this book, because it is really dense. It involves a lot of details. And I think that kind of speaks to Robinson's style of telling things as if he's relaying a history. And so a lot of the chapters have a ton of examples, in the sense that they're almost kind of a record, or he's trying to put forward kind of like a fake history of what's going to happen in the future. The main plot revolves around a woman named Mary, who is an Irish minister who is the head of this Ministry for the Future. And the idea behind this ministry is that it's a global organization that's working to address climate change. And by this time in the future, we've had plenty of disasters. Another one of the characters, Frank, he's also kind of integral to the story. He is really traumatized because he's a foreign aid worker in India when a really devastating heat wave occurs, killing millions of people. And so in this future, there are climate disasters all the time, and you're really starting to see the destruction and the devastation of climate change. But each chapter is kind of told from a different point of view. And so for a lot of the book, we follow Mary's story as she's trying to get different central banks throughout the world, or different ministries, or different scientists on board to try and back their plans for trying to reduce the amount of carbon emissions. But it also follows Frank as he tries to kind of navigate all of the torment that he feels from being traumatized by this horrible ecological disaster that he experienced. And he becomes really radicalized and joins kind of these eco-terrorists as well. But throughout, you also get kind of snippets into various characters or scenarios that are really just an avenue for Robinson to share all of this research that he's done into future technologies or future solutions that could address climate change. And so that I found to be very overwhelming, but also very impressive. I can kind of tell when an author is adding a lot of detail and a lot of facts around subject matters where they haven't really done their due diligence, because I feel like it doesn't really hold together. And in particular, the test for me is when Robinson would write about issues that I know more about, such as China or certain tech issues. And when I did read his kind of portrayal or how he set that up, it did seem to ring true. And so sometimes I think it can be a bit over ambitious to try and build this entire world just based off of your own kind of layman knowledge and research, but I think he really pulls it off. Some of the interesting concepts that he kind of introduces include, for example, there's the introduction of a central bank digital currency that is backed by crypto called a carbon coin. And I guess actually it's not a CBDC because it's not necessarily backed by, it is backed by governments, but it's also its value is tied to if you can remove 1 ton of carbon from the atmosphere or prevent it from being emitted, then you get 1 carbon coin. So that's one example of a lot of in-depth kind of exploration for how central banks and currency could operate in the future to try and address negative effects of climate change. And he really goes into a lot of detail on that. So for example, he talks about tax havens, and because now there is this digital ledger of the carbon coin, there's no longer like illicit tax havens. He also sets up these different scenes where central bank governors are coming together and trying to figure out how they can make the financial system work towards their climate change goals. So that's just one example of maybe like 10 different topics where he provides a really detailed and nuanced exploration of what this could look like and what it requires from different leaders, from business people, a little bit from everyday citizens. Some of the other topics that he covers are what's going to happen to refugees and like the number of climate refugees that are going to appear because of climate change. He also talks about social media, and he predicts that in the future there's going to be this technology where no longer is our data being sold to tech companies for advertising, but instead we have something called like your lock or my lock, I forget the name of it, but it's this made up social media where everything's encrypted so that you have full control over your data, and that allows for more trust on social media. He also does really dive into like specific climate technologies, and so he spends several chapters following these glaciologists who are trying to extract seawater from under the glaciers and repump them to the top of the glaciers so that they'll freeze, and then add to the amount of like landmass of the glaciers. So in essence, reducing the amount of sea level rise that is going to be happening. And so when he writes out those chapters, you can tell he definitely read like a lot of scientific papers and kind of just copied and pasted, or at least directly reference that research into building out these chapters around potential solutions for how we might address climate change. I'm not exactly sure like how much of this is accurate, but I definitely get the sense that he's done a ton of like real life modern day research into potential technologies and just has pulled that kernel of an idea or maybe that one article out to its full fruition and kind of imagine what that would look like 20 or 30 years from now. It was nice to kind of have all of these different ideas really teased out, and as someone who hasn't really kept tabs on what potential solutions might be for climate change, I did find it to be an interesting kind of survey of all the things that could potentially give us hope for the future. There are definitely some flaws and some missteps. There are some chapters where he is assuming the voice of an abstract entity and it's a riddle and you have to kind of figure out who it is. That kind of came off as childish. I think overall the book is way too long. I kind of struggled because there were so many interesting ideas packed into this novel, and I felt presented in a way that made it really exciting to think about. And so much of what we hear about climate change is just really depressing. And if you read the news, you kind of feel like here and now there's not a lot of hope, but because he's able to project several decades into the future, you kind of can see how these technologies play out and how they might be part of the solution. And a lot of the things that he posits are a little like out there. I mean, especially the role of eco-terrorism. I mean, one of the ways that carbon emissions really go down is that these eco-terrorists just start bombing planes, and they also inject mad cow disease into the beef supply, so people become vegetarians and they stop flying. And so to me, I understand the point, like something drastic needs to change, but it's a little bit unrealistic that those things would actually happen or that anyone would want those things to happen. Overall, a little bit overwhelming and unwieldy because it's so long, in my opinion. I also think besides Mary and Frank, a lot of the characters are not really that well fleshed out, and I think the overall flow could have really been served by having one or two other characters that we could latch on to, because right now it's a little bit too much in one. There is a very like plot heavy, plot driven, character driven thrust with what happens with Mary and Frank. Mary, as she's trying to kind of carve a path for the ministry for the future and make all these global decisions, and Frank as he goes on this emotional journey. But beyond that, everybody else is kind of just there as a tool to kind of share some of this research or these technologies or the point of view that needs to be included in Robinson's history. It was a little bit confusing to have large chunks of just kind of research or description or almost like historical record also paired along the journey of these characters. And then also there would be like random, really philosophical, abstract chapters on what is the purpose of a society, or what is the purpose of, I don't know, taxes, or like various kind of theoretical concepts. Because he's trying to have such a comprehensive and thorough exploration of society in the future, it feels like he has to pack in a ton, and that is a little bit overwhelming. I think if it were like 30% shorter, I'd be recommending it to a lot of people. My overall rating for this book is going to be a 4 out of 5. I think if you're willing to kind of devote a lot of time and patience to something that's a little bit on the longer side and really goes into a lot of depth, it is pretty rewarding. But I also know one of my book club members was kind of saying there's nothing really new in here, and she was expecting maybe some novel ideas for how we might address climate change, whereas I think this is really, the strength of this book is really more in pulling from what already exists only as like a kernel of an idea today and drawing it out to its fruition to see what the world might look like in the 2030s or the 2040s if all of these things kind of come into play, and if we realize we have to take radical change and radical action in order to address climate change. Most of the book was set in Zurich as well, and so the descriptions of Zurich made me really miss Zurich. It just painted Zurich in such a beautiful light. I kind of felt like some of the chapters were a love story to Zurich, so that's another little fun tidbit in case any of you also love Zurich and kind of want to relive the quaintness and kind of the Swiss ethos through reading this book. The second book I read is Dune by Frank Herbert. I'm pretty sure that I read it in high school, but upon a second reread, there were many things I didn't remember, so now I think maybe I never actually finished it. This is obviously the science fiction classic written by Frank Herbert. I think it came out in 1970 or thereabouts, and I'm sure most of you have read it or have seen the movie. There was also a David Lynch movie version made of this book in the 80s. And most recently just came out with Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya, and I saw the movie and I thought it was great, but I started my reread before seeing the movie and finished it after seeing the movie. So this is kind of my adult lens on rereading Dune. I remember really liking it the first time I read it, and the second time around I still really liked it. I think I was able to pick up on a lot more of the themes than when I read it in high school, but it's much more of a fantasy and kind of like epic science fiction novel than I remembered. I have been recommending Dune to a lot of people since the movie came out, saying like, oh, it's great, you should read it, you should read it. But on retrospect, now that I've reread it, I find that maybe it's not as mainstream as I thought, and I probably wouldn't recommend it to everyone. I would recommend it to people who are into sci-fi. Upon my second reread, one thing that really stood out to me, and also from the movie, is just the strength of the mother-son relationship between Jessica and Paul. And I maybe just have a more extensive vocabulary or like knowledge of mother-son relationships. Like I feel like it's very biblical. I feel like that's a very strong motif and theme to really draw upon for Dune, and I think like the first time I read it I wouldn't necessarily have picked up on it so much, but so much of Dune is about destiny and like what is written in the cards and whether Paul's prophecies are going to come true and whether he really has a choice. And I think it's really interesting how Jessica plays a role in that as his mother, because the Bene Gesserit have this like ultimate plan that they're trying to execute in terms of the genetic breeding program. And Jessica obviously like really loves her son, but also is beholden to this other allegiance and this like cult, I guess, that she's part of, which has such a specific plan for him. And I think their relationship throughout the first book is just a really complex and nuanced and powerful relationship. And I love that that was also shown in the movie. And I think that's kind of one of the most impactful parts of the book that I came away with this time around. I also thought the ecological message was really strong, and so that's kind of interesting how there's a similarity between Ministry for the Future, which is all about climate change, and Dune, which came 40 years earlier and really is a book about Arrakis being a planet that's totally uninhabitable and really barren and tough and difficult to live on. But the fact that the planetologist Keynes is able to convince the Freemen who are living there of this future vision where Arrakis is lush and there's running water and there's plenty of plants, it's really a strong statement about a group of people or a society being able to sacrifice and give up so much for future generations, like for a future result that they themselves will not even experience. And I feel like that was one of the key takeaways from Ministry for the Future is, are we able to value future humans, and how do we put a price on future generations? And in Dune, that's not even up for discussion. On Arrakis, because of the strength of the message that Keynes is able to disseminate to the Freemen, they are already convinced of that. And it really requires religion and mysticism and like almost something above, something that transcends logic in order for them to be able to sacrifice so much now for the future generations. And that's something that also is kind of touched upon in Ministry for the Future, is one of the ministers says, like, we need to invent a religion. Like, the only way people are gonna come on board is if there's some like religious aspect to this. I really enjoyed the backstabbing and the conniving and the political elements of Dune. I think that is something that really is a strength of the book, but is very difficult to translate on screen. And I think it was a good decision by Dennis, the director of Dune, to not try to give too much of the political backstory. It kind of reminds me of the prequels in Star Wars, where Lucas really tries to paint a really like realistic backdrop to the plot, and it just confused everyone. And so I think Villeneuve made a good call in kind of like culling a lot of the political and kind of backstory of how the emperor and the different houses and the baron really tries to achieve his political goals. The movie actually only shows the first half of the book, and so there are many events from the book that aren't included in the movie, which I assume will come out when the sequel is out. But I thought that that's kind of the value of reading the book, is you can kind of like really dive deep into all of the politics and like the history that Frank Herbert spells out. That's kind of one of my favorite parts of this type of sci-fi, is kind of that made up world building of backstory. One of the cons from reading the book is I just don't really get the whole, like, Paul is so afraid. This is kind of spoiler alert if you haven't read the book or you've only seen the first movie, but Paul is like terrified of jihad, and like he's going to become this messiah figure where thousands of people will die in service of his name. And Dune is supposed to be kind of this like warning story of like a foreigner coming in and then harnessing like the power of a local population to become like consumed with mysticism or consumed with like devotion to this one person. And throughout the book, he talks about being afraid of jihad and how this can't happen. And I feel like that's just kind of really plopped in there, and Frank Herbert doesn't do enough to build it up and make logical steps towards that fear. And I guess that's kind of my main critique, I would say, of Dune, is a lot of it is just told instead of shown. For example, Yue being able to break his imperial conditioning, that's something that's like told several times throughout the novel. That's like really key to his betrayal of the House of Atreides. And instead of it being shown like how crazy it is, the fact that he's able to break his imperial conditioning, it's just like stated several times by the characters. Like the character will just be like, oh, I can't believe that he could break his conditioning. And so that's just kind of one example, but I feel like throughout a lot of Dune, there are examples of Herbert just kind of telling components of the world instead of like really showing and building out. So I wouldn't say it's like my favorite example of world building, but it's also just so ambitious in the themes that it's trying to touch on. I feel like you can kind of look over that, and now it's like such a cult classic and so many people love Dune, and there are all these Dune heads out there. I feel like it's almost blasphemous to say this, like people just fully have bought that this is the world and this is how it works, and they're fully conversant in it and they're fully fluent in it. But if you're kind of like a lay person or someone who's just picking up Dune and reading it with like fresh eyes, I do think that there are a lot of components of the world that Frank Herbert is telling us instead of like really crafting out or like showing us through certain actions or scenes. I also found the pacing of the book quite different than what I remembered. Like a lot happens. There are 3 parts to the book, and Paul undergoes an extraordinary transformation from the first part to the 3rd part. And I read it pretty quickly, maybe over the course of 2 weeks, and it was kind of a lot to consume in 2 weeks because you go from Paul being like this spoiled teenager on Caladan to becoming like almost a messiah at the end of the book. And he's married Princess Irulan and has a concubine. So it's like a lot of character development that needs to happen. But I think it works. It's just kind of a feature of this genre too, to kind of tell like these large episodes. I did really enjoy I don't know why, it's kind of weird that I enjoyed this so much, but I really enjoyed like all the scenes with the Baron and him trying to scheme and like his insecurity and how he would kind of second guess himself or sometimes be overconfident. I don't know, I just thought the characterization of the Baron is actually really well done, whereas sometimes Paul kind of comes off as like this arrogant man-child, which I don't know how much of that is intentional because Herbert does want him to kind of be an anti-hero, I think. Like he's not really supposed to be someone we idolize, but it's just like less enjoyable, I feel, to kind of go along the ride with Paul as he's like trying to figure out all these like emotional, deep things that are gonna happen to him. I think the Bene Gesserit witches should have their own spin-off. They're super cool. I think like sometimes I did wonder about like the role of women and the treatment of women in this book. I think it could have been a lot worse. I feel like both Chani and Jessica really, they're not just like tools for the plot, but they also actually have power. And I just love the last line of the book, which is Jessica telling Chani or reassuring her that even though Paul is going to be marrying Princess Irulan so that he can become emperor, and she'll only be a concubine, she tells her, history will look upon us as wives. And Jessica is like such a strong character throughout the book, and not just as Paul's mother, but kind of in her own right as well, that I do feel that it wasn't as cringy as it could have been, and which is actually kind of surprising given this book was written in the mid-60s to 70s. And so I really do feel like the Bene Gesserits should get their own like retelling or their own spin-off, or someone should like try and write, I don't know, like a prequel of, maybe this already exists and I'm totally clueless, but I do really think there's a lot of content to be mined in the whole Bene Gesserit story and origin story. Overall, I really enjoyed rereading Dune. I think maybe I skimmed it a little bit too much because it was also a lot longer than I remembered, but I really enjoyed it, and I am so excited for the sequel to come out. And I liked reading the book because I do have several friends who are Dune heads. Shout out to Tim, who I saw the movie with. And I'll also link his podcast below. He and a couple of his friends did a reaction to the novel, but I thought it was really fun to read and definitely worth it if you're going to be watching the movie or the sequel. And I'm really looking forward to the second movie. And if I have a lot of free time, I might read the second and third books, but I do know that they're also long and maybe a little bit more out there. But overall, I will give this a 4.3 out of 5 and definitely recommend checking it out. Okay, thanks guys if you made it this far for watching the video. If you heard ringing throughout, that was just someone clearing the spirits from the building and giving us good juju, so hopefully it wasn't too distracting. It was really fun to read these two science fiction novels that were similar in some of the themes, but also very different in style. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like or hit subscribe, and I will be making another video for the books that I'm gonna read in November as well as December, so keep an eye out for that.